Welcome to another discussion of Translating Technobabble. My guest today is Thomas Burleson. My name's Jesse Sanders. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jesse. Today we're here to talk about React and Angular. Should I choose React or should I choose Angular? And what are the factors that go into that?
Right, absolutely.
And often people will get reasons for why they should choose one or another that are very technical. And I want to bring that up a little higher for managers and executives who are not actually coders to be able to understand some of the things in critical issues and perspectives on this. The landscape's changed over the last 3 or 4 years. I think 3 years ago, if someone had asked my opinion about whether they should use React or Angular, I would have said something very different than I'm going to be saying and recommending today.
So what's changed in the last 3 or 4 years?
Mostly the tooling and the ecosystem and the maturity of developers. One of the things I recommend companies to avoid is pursuing a technology stack just because it's a bright, shiny new toy, right? There has to be some real valid criteria for going into choosing a particular tech stack and to understanding the consequences thereof. And I think it's a really interesting set of pros and cons about why you would choose one versus another.
Okay, so what kind of examples?
Well, for example, these slides talk about the difficulty of using React or Angular. When I first started looking at these, they hit home for me really well. So let's take, for example, React.
Okay.
When a developer is looking at using React, the technology to build a web application, often they have very fast success. They can get involved very quickly with the technology without a lot of knowledge. They can go read the docs pretty quickly, get started and demonstrate some success very fast. And so often, though, that's used as the driving criteria for saying, well, let's use this from now on. Let's continue. Let's take this initial idea. Oh, now let's release our product with it. And I think that's a mistake.
So it's really the decisions being based on how simple it is to get started versus maybe what would be the best choice long-term potentially.
Absolutely right? Because there's a big difference between experimenting and playing with the technology and trying to deliver a real production application.
Right.
And it's not just the technology itself, it's also the tooling around it. Like, how do you build it? How do you deploy it? How would you test with it? If we look at the curve, we can see that React is really easy to get involved with. And then it hits sort of a peak where we call it sort of that difficult level. And I've even labeled it the Wild West, where all of a sudden they're not being as productive because they've hit in issues of, well, where do they get a forms library package, and how do they add forms? How do they add data services, and how do they do their state management, and how do they compress their application when they want to build it?
Okay, so how are those decisions being made?
Well, in the case of React, it was often ad hoc, in my opinion, right? So it was whatever tooling the developer found. He might pull a tool off one shelf and another tool off another shelf and say, oh, I can use these, and he'd figure out how to plug them together. And eventually, developers are smart. Eventually, they're going to get it to work, and they would get something to work. And so what this chart shows is that they're going to hit this productivity barrier where things slow down. And then gradually they'll get more familiar with the ecosystem they're putting together, and they understand the sort of the flow of how to add other views and other things. And then it'll sort of level out, and then they'll be more productive. It doesn't mean their productivity increases, but that productivity level will sort of be maintained.
So how does that differ from, let's say, Angular?
The challenge with Angular is if you don't have the base foundation and what I call the foundational training with Angular, it can be very hard to get involved.
Let's take a second here. What do you mean by that base, that foundation? What does that mean to you?
That's a good point. So Angular has a whole bunch of conventions. The way you're supposed to use Angular, and it has tons of libraries. It has tons of patterns that you use to scale and build up your application.
Okay.
So both of these applications are view-based. In other words, the whole goal is to create views.
Okay.
Views that will show in a browser. With Angular, though, the real tendency is that developers don't approach application development from the view first. They approach it from the data first. What is the data flow and the data services and the business logic that we want to have in our application? And then they fit the views on top of that.
And so in React, it's...
In React, I feel it's the other way around. In React, you're building views and you're composing hierarchies of views, but you're not so much thinking about layering your business logic and all that. So with React, often the business logic can get mixed in with the views way too much, and it's not best practices.
So if I'm a manager and I don't really understand everything that you're saying here, what's the complexity then of having this business logic inside of my components? What's the harm here?
That's a great question. The biggest reason that you don't want to do that is A, it isolates your business logic, so it's within the component. It's hard to reuse. B, it's very difficult to test your business logic. What I tell teams is they want to try to write their application. Imagine if I came along and I said, we're ripping out all the views.
Okay.
I should be able to test all of your application, all your business logic, your data flow, and the changes of your state of your data without any UI.
Okay.
Ideally. And then you put UI on it, because what does UI allow you to do? The UI does only two things. It renders the data so you can see it, and it allows you to interact with it to do things like delete this row, add this element, update this form. So the UI just allows you to interact with the business logic.
Okay.
And in React, it's very easy to mix those. It doesn't mean that it's impossible to keep it separate. What it means is that it's easy to do the wrong things.
So kind of like a tendency.
There's a tendency. Yes,
it's really easy to enter. Okay, so that makes sense.
And in Angular, yes, I've seen really bad Angular applications too, don't get me wrong. However, Angular is the way they approach building your applications from a set of features and reusing libraries and layering your application in terms of UI and data services and business logic and state management. It makes it very easy to use those patterns, and then when new developers come on board to the team, or you have one person that transitions to another product effort and you need another person to come on board the current one, it's very easy for them to get involved because it's a set of repeated patterns.
Interesting. So this is the base foundation that you were speaking of.
This is the base foundation. Also, Angular has a suite of libraries that come with it. We can see that Angular has a whole bunch of libraries that come as part of the platform. We have localization or internationalization. We have routing, lazy loading. We have forms. We have HTTP RESTful service features. All of these are baked right into the platform, and the way they interact is very well defined. So once you know how these parts are made to work together, it's super easy to use. And in my opinion, one of the things I love most about Angular is the idea of dependency injection. So
what is dependency injection?
Dependency injection essentially allows you to configure how components are going to be created.
Okay.
And then when you request an instance of that component, whether it's a service or a view or anything, you don't care how it was created. You don't care what it depends upon. You can just say, give me an instance and you can use it. Now, that doesn't seem like a big deal. In testing, though, it's a very big deal, because what you want to be able to say is, give me an instance of the component, but how it's been configured behind the scenes is, you've asked for component A, I'm going to give you a mock. Your code doesn't have to change one bit. I'm giving you a mock because now I can test it. So this idea of DI radically simplifies how you do testing, which then, of course, radically improves the quality of your application.
Now, this isn't something that Angular created. This dependency injection's been around.
It's been around for a long time, right?
Gotcha.
It was around in the Flex world with Flash. There are other platforms that use this. However, I think it was more formalized in Angular. Now, the React team, in contrast, also says, well, we have DI available. I wouldn't really call it DI, but they do have a mechanism that they allow that. So you may be thinking, oh, Thomas is pro Angular and not, and con on React. Actually, that's not true at all. I like them both. But then the question comes, well, how do you choose one or the other? And actually, I contend you don't have to choose one or the other. There are just some considerations for what your choice has an impact on. Now, the really interesting thing is, if we take Angular and we take React, what happens if you have a product in a company, one's done in Angular and one is done in React, and you have developers and you want them to switch teams? Angular developers, it's pretty easy, in my opinion, for an Angular developer to go and work on a React project. They have to know 3 to 4 to 5 key things, but after that, it's pretty easy for them to work on a React project.
Okay.
It's significantly harder for a non-Angular developer or React developer to come and work on Angular projects because of the foundational knowledge that's needed
Gotcha.
there.
So it's the base foundation that's lacking for
Correct.
understanding the constructs of Angular, if you will?
Correct. And the patterns that are going to be used, right? What I often look at is what's the ROI of investing into a technology stack? What you want is a product that has good customer success and is stable, and you minimize regressions between releases. And so that means you have to be able to test it well. And you also want an ecosystem that you can then hand off to other developers if you need to,
Sure.
right? And both can do that. One just requires more of a deliberate focus on patterns versus maybe Angular requires not so much of a deliberate because it more forces you to follow these patterns. So if we look at React, for example, one of the great things about React is that it's super easy to experiment, right?
Okay.
It's just super easy to get started and say, I want to build a view and play with it, how it's going to lay out, how it's going to render. Oh, I need some data. I'll just do that, right? I can just play with it, a proof of concept.
Mm-hmm.
Often we know the problem with that is that a proof of concept then goes to ship it.
Production, right? Enterprise application.
Absolutely.
Congratulations.
Exactly. And even though we all protest and say, no, it's a proof of concept. No, we want to encourage people to always say experimentation should be one, validate the ideas, and then rewrite from the ground up. And it can be very fast, actually, the real production version.
Right.
So that's one thing. The other thing in React is it's really easy to compose view hierarchies. If you want to have a view that has a whole bunch of other views, you can play with that very quickly in React because React is really an application library, a development environment for building views. And am I missing anything else? Let's see. Oh, you can do lightweight builds. And so you can have, in general, it can be a lot smaller deployment. And the most important thing about React is that it renders super fast. Their whole ecosystem is around identifying what's changed and then only updating in the screen that you see the parts that have actually changed. And it renders very, very fast. Now, Angular is working on these changes to make similar types of improvements. But Angular has other pros that are a little bit different. So in Angular, it's really easy to build layered application where you're separating out because the whole platform encourages you to build your UI and build your data services and build your state management and then your business logic and keep those partitioned in layers.
So that's what you mean by layers is having those.
And so you keep them in layers and then it's very easy to test those layers. And remember when I said what happens if you would go to a developer and say, what if I challenge you to say, rip out your UI? Mm-hmm. Would I still have the business logic and the state management and everything else? In an ideal world, yes, you would. And not just in an ideal world, in a well-architected application, you would. You could just rip out the UI and put in new UI. So that's something that the Angular system makes fairly easy for you to do. What else? Angular makes it really easy to build business forms. In React, the library doesn't come with another forms library. It's not part of the base library. So you'd have to go out and figure out what other library package you want and all that. With Angular, it has built-in forms features.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of pros on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm an exec,
mm-hmm.
how am I supposed to make a decision on which one I should use?
For me, it comes down to a whole bunch of criteria points.
Okay.
One of them is, do you have a single developer?
Okay.
Or do you have multiple developers? Do you have a single team or multiple teams?
Mm-hmm.
If you have any of those and they're only familiar with React, then switching over to Angular may not be the win you want. Right? If you have multiple teams and one's React and one's Angular, that's okay. You could still have a successful multiple product delivery. You just have to plan it properly and you have to enforce some constraints on your developers. Because what you don't want is one team going off and doing something totally different and all their effort, it cannot be reused. And then another team is doing best practices, right? So that's a major factor is how many people are developing the software product that you want.
Okay, so people's one. What other things should I consider?
Skills. If they already know Angular, then they can do Angular or they could learn React pretty quickly.
Okay.
If they know React, they can also come in on board to an Angular team, but it's just going to be more of a challenge, and you're going to have to provide some foundational training for them.
Gotcha.
That's one thing.
That makes sense.
The other one is, do you just want to get something out the door quickly? Or do you want a product that's going to have a long life cycle that is actually you feel is going to be used by customers and it's going to persist for 3 to 5 years? And 5 years on a software world is almost eternity, right?
Right.
So after 5 years, the game changes over. Usually you're going to choose a total different technology stack. Often you're going to step back and reevaluate what the product does. But until then, you want something that you can continue with a minimal amount of investment of effort and ideally budget, you can keep enhancing and maintaining. So quick release or long-term life cycle is another one. And I think maybe this relates to the whole idea of it's easy with React to experiment and do a quick release.
Gotcha.
It's harder to just do quick experiments with Angular, but it's also easier to build apps that have longer life cycle support.
Interesting. Okay.
And notice I haven't given a recommendation one way or another. In fact, what you're going to hear me say more often than not is both are great, and it depends on the team that you have. If you're starting simply from scratch, then the question is, well, actually now in the community, there are a huge number of React developers and there's a huge number of Angular developers. So which one do you go with? I think it probably depends on the complexity of the product you're trying to deliver. And that's not something that we could just give an answer during this call, right?
Sure.
Right. That's one of those where you almost need to sit down with a group or some industry leads and say, what are your thoughts on this?
Sure. Absolutely.
But I do think that there are some best practices that we can recommend to teams that are looking at, how can they use React or Angular or even both, right?
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah. Can we cover some best practices?
Sure. I actually have some notes I prepared here for us.
Excellent.
So these are the things I say to companies almost every week. One of the first things that you should do, whether you're using React only or Angular or both, what you want to be able to do is reuse your code as much as possible.
Definitely.
You might want to release and deploy a React app and another one as an Angular app, but ultimately under the hood, they should be reusing as much code as possible. Now, in React and Angular, you're not going to reuse the Vue components, but you can reuse everything else if you do it the right way. So one of the first ways to do that is you should be using a monorepo, right?
Okay.
So if you use a monorepository, that's probably the first thing that promotes code collaboration, code sharing.
Absolutely. Yep.
Then you should be using TypeScript. Now, this is the one that will get a lot of non-Angular developers all in uproar. The reality is, though, what's the saying? 80% or developers spend 80% of their time fixing bugs.
Right.
And TypeScript allows the developers to be warned about the problems with the code they're writing while they're writing the code. The other things the team should focus on, whether you're using React or Angular, you should keep your business logic outside of your views. Absolutely should do that. You should be proactively investigating how to create reactive applications. And what I mean by a reactive application is an application where the view simply reacts to the data that's coming in. It renders the data. And then when the user interacts with that view, or the web app, if you might call it, that interaction gets sent off someplace else. We don't know how it's handled, what it does, all the details on that. Someplace else handles it, and then if the data changes again, that new data is delivered and the views re-render. And that's what we mean by reactive apps. And that's something that Briebug is really actively promoting, is how to build reactive architectures. I think the people that are doing it right are Stencil.js to build true web components, or taking UI library components, wrapping them and publishing them as a web component. And then Ionic, for example, takes those web components and puts wrappers around them so they're easily used in Angular or React. And that's the win-win.
All right.
And then ultimately we have testing.
Testing's huge.
Right? We have Jest testing, and for unit testing and integration testing. We have some people try to use those to test their UI components, which I think are worthless. I'm going to say to the audience, worthless.
That's a pretty strong word there. What would you use instead?
I would use Cypress.
Cypress is
right?
great.
Cypress, or sometimes known as end-to-end testing, is really about not just UI testing and UI workflow testing, but it can even be used for snapshot testing. So you can take a snapshot of your UI at one point, make some code changes, and take another snapshot of your UI and see what the changes are. Were the changes as intended, or was it an unexpected change, right?
Very good point. Well, I think this is a really great explanation for the technology recommendations, or what I would call best practices in the industry. I just want to let everybody know that if you are building either an Angular app or a React app and you need some help, we're here to help.
Absolutely.
So
and we have a wealth of experience. And often this isn't just experience from one or two projects. It's experience from helping clients solve problems that are real world problems. And as we help articulate how to get around the blockage or resolve the issue, that becomes part of our toolkit, those approaches and patterns.
Absolutely. Being able to share experience from other large-scale enterprise clients and be able to bring that knowledge directly to your organization. So with that, Thomas, I really appreciate you coming on today and helping us translate some of this Technobabble. Thanks again. Great to have you.
Thanks, Jesse.
Until next time.